The sun burned mercilessly over the parched village of Sundervale, a place once known for its golden wheat and singing streams. Now only dust and silence filled the air. For Lila, a slender girl of 17 with tired eyes and calloused hands, each dawn felt heavier than the last. Her days began before sunrise, fetching water from a nearly dry well, tending to a dying garden, and caring for her two younger siblings while her mother, Mira, stitched clothes to earn a few coins. Their father had died 2 years ago after a fever swept through the valley. He had left behind debts to the landlord, Mr. Haran, a man whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance. Since then, the family's life had been a slow descent into desperation. Each week, Haran's men came to collect payment, and each week Mira bowed her head lower, begging for more time. Lila watched her mother's strength fade. The lines on Mira's face deepened, her eyes losing their light. Lila had long dreamed of becoming a teacher. She used to help the village children learn to read under a tree by the old well. But dreams were luxuries they could no longer afford. Their priority now was survival. Then one evening, as the sun sank behind the cracked fields, Haran himself came to their doorstep. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His voice was calm, almost kind, but there was a chilling emptiness in his eyes. He spoke not of debt, but of arrangement. He told Mira that he would forgive everything, every coin owed, every unpaid interest, and if Lila became his wife. Lila froze where she stood, her hands trembling around the bowl of rice she had been serving. The world seemed to stop. Her mother dropped her sewing needle, her face pale with shock. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mira whispered, "She's just a girl." Haran smiled faintly. "A girl who can save her family." That night, silence settled over their small mud house. Lila lay awake, listening to the wind scraping against the walls. Her siblings slept beside her, unaware of the storm about to break. Mira sat by the dying fire, crying softly. Lila could hear her murmuring prayers, but they sounded more like apologies. In the morning, the decision was made. There was no money, no help, no miracle. The landlord had given them 2 days to accept, or lose everything, including their home. Lila saw the hopelessness in her mother's eyes and understood. Poverty was its own kind of chain, and sometimes love was forced to sacrifice itself under its weight. Still, a part of her refused to surrender. That evening, she ran to the hill overlooking the village where her father used to take her to watch the stars. The sky stretched endlessly above her, painted with colors of dusk. Lila knelt on the dry earth and whispered, "If there's a God, if there's anything left of mercy in this world, change my fate, please." Tears rolled down her cheeks, carving clean lines through the dust on her skin. A single shooting star streaked across the horizon, and for a heartbeat, she dared to believe it was a sign that something, somewhere, had heard her. When she returned home, her mother had already begun sewing a wedding dress from old white cloth. The sight nearly broke her. Lila pressed her lips together to keep from screaming. Her childhood had ended before she could say goodbye to it. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of a church bell, marking the start of another day, and the end of everything Lila once dreamed of being. The morning of Lila's wedding rose gray and heavy, as though even the sky mourned what was to come. The village awoke early, not from joy or excitement, but from a curious hush, the kind that falls before a storm. News had spread quickly. The poor girl from the edge of town was marrying old Mr. Haran, the same man who once collected debts like clockwork. Inside their small hut, Lila sat motionless as her mother braided her hair. The gown Mira had sewn, a simple white dress made from patched fabric, hung loosely on her thin frame. The scent of jasmine oil lingered faintly in the air, but it could not hide the bitterness in their hearts. Her younger brother and sister peeked from behind the curtain, too young to understand why their sister's wedding felt like a funeral. Mira's hands trembled as she tied a thin ribbon around Lila's wrist. "You'll be safe now," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He won't let us starve." Lila didn't answer. Her heart beat quietly, almost detached from her body. Every sound, the rustle of cloth, the murmurs outside, the neighing of horses, seemed distant, unreal. She wanted to scream, to run, to hide in the fields beyond the village, but the weight of her mother's eyes, filled with guilt and fear, held her still. When Haran's carriage arrived, a hush fell over the crowd that had gathered. He stepped down wearing a dark suit, polished boots, and a gold chain across his vest, a picture of wealth and power. Lila couldn't look at him without feeling her stomach twist. His smile was polite, practiced. To the onlookers, he was the image of generosity, the rich man rescuing a poor family. To Lila, he was the price of survival. The ceremony took place in the small village chapel. The air was thick with dust and candle smoke. A few neighbors came, some out of pity, some out of curiosity. The old priest stumbled through the words, his voice trembling as he read the vows. When he said, "Do you take this man?" Lila hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. Her mother's soft sob reminded her what was at stake. She whispered, "I do," though the words felt like ashes in her mouth. Haran slipped a gold ring onto her finger, cold, heavy, and unfamiliar. When he leaned in to kiss her forehead, she flinched ever so slightly. A few women in the crowd turned away, unable to watch. After the vows, Haran placed a thick envelope of money into Mira's hands. "Your debts are gone," he said smoothly. "Take care of the little ones." Mira nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. As the carriage door closed and the horses began to move, she clutched the money but looked as though she'd just buried her own heart. Through the small window, Lila watched her home grow smaller until it disappeared behind the dusty road. Her siblings ran after the carriage for a few steps, waving goodbye. Her little sister called her name, Lila, before her voice was swallowed by the distance. When the carriage reached Haran's estate, the sight struck her. Tall iron gates, grand marble steps, and windows that reflected the pale sun. It should have been beautiful, but to Lila it looked like a gilded prison. Servants bowed as she entered, their faces blank, practiced in silence. Haran led her through the mansion, his hand resting on her back like a weight she couldn't escape. "You'll want for nothing here," he said. "You'll learn to be content." That night, as the house fell quiet, Lila sat by the large window of her new room. Outside, the fields stretched endlessly, but they no longer belonged to her world. The stars she had once prayed to now seemed out of reach. When she finally laid her head down, she felt the cold sheets beneath her and thought, "So this is what safety costs." She closed her eyes, and a single tear slid down her cheek. The first of many that would mark her new life as the bride who never truly said yes. The mansion that now belonged to Lila shimmered under the morning sun, white marble walls, wide verandas, and fountains that sang with endless water. Yet for all its beauty, it felt hollow. Every echo in its hallways reminded her that she was no longer free. Her new husband, Mr. Haran, lived by order and routine. He rose before dawn, ate breakfast precisely at 7, and spent the day managing his land and accounts. When he spoke to Lila, it was not with cruelty but with cold authority. He treated her as one might handle a delicate object, something to be kept polished and quiet. "You are to stay indoors," he told her one morning, sipping tea without looking up. "It's unbecoming for a wife to wander the village. The staff will bring you whatever you need." Lila nodded, though the words tightened around her like a rope. Every room in the mansion seemed designed to remind her of her place. From the portraits of Haran's ancestors on the walls to the locked study she was forbidden to enter. Her only company was Mara, the elderly housekeeper who moved silently like a shadow. Mara spoke little, but her eyes held a flicker of sympathy. She showed Lila where the linens were kept, how to ring the bell for meals, and which doors she should not open. "This house remembers everything," Mara once whispered, "so be careful what you wish inside it." Days blurred into one another. Lila tried to keep busy, cleaning, sewing, and tending to the empty garden behind the mansion. The flowers had long since withered, much like the laughter that once lived in her. Sometimes she would stand by the high iron gate and watch the villagers pass, but they never looked her way. They feared the old man and pitied his young bride. At night, the silence became unbearable. The ticking of the grand clock echoed through the halls like a heartbeat she couldn't escape. Haran would retire to his study, often locking the door behind him, leaving her to dine alone. The meals were rich, roasted meats, fresh bread, sweet pastries, but Lila could barely swallow a bite. Each mouthful tasted like guilt. One evening, while exploring the garden, she heard a faint sound, the fluttering of wings. Following it, she found a small bird tangled in a net near the hedge. Its feathers were streaked with dust, its heart pounding frantically against the trap. Lila knelt and gently freed it, murmuring softly, "You're safe now." When it flew from her hands into the open sky, she whispered, "If you can find your way back to freedom, maybe I will too." That fragile creature became her silent companion in spirit, a promise that her soul would not break, no matter how gilded her cage became. Still, the days grew lonelier. Haran's health began to falter, and with it his patience. When Lila accidentally broke a vase one morning, his temper snapped. He didn't strike her, but his voice, sharp and venomous, cut deep. "Ungrateful girl," he hissed. "Do you know what it cost me to make you mine?" That night, Lila cried quietly in her room, staring at her reflection in the mirror, a pale girl with tired eyes, wearing silk that didn't belong to her world. She wondered if her mother ever thought of her, or if the money had brought her family peace. The thought hurt more than the memory of Haran's words. Days turned to weeks, and Lila learned to move like a ghost, silent, invisible, obedient. Yet inside her heart, something small and bright refused to die. She dreamed of the fields, of laughter, of the life she once had. Every night before bed, she opened her window and whispered into the wind, "I am still here." She didn't know it yet, but soon, fate would hear her whisper and send someone who would change everything. It was late afternoon when the sky over Haran's estate darkened, heavy with the promise of rain. Thunder rolled across the fields, and a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. Lila was in the garden, gathering sheets that had been left to dry when the first drops began to fall. She ran toward the veranda, clutching the wet linen when she saw a figure approaching through the storm. The man walked slowly, his coat soaked, a satchel slung over one shoulder. He looked weary but steady, his steps firm even as the rain pounded harder. When he reached the gate, he called out to the servant at the entrance, asking for shelter until the storm passed. From the parlor window, Lila watched as he removed his hat, revealing a kind, rugged face framed by damp hair and eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and gentleness. The servant hesitated, unsure whether to admit a stranger, but Haran himself appeared, drawn by the commotion. "A traveler?" he demanded. "Yes, sir," the man replied, his voice calm and deep. "My name is Elias, a craftsman and supplier. I was delivering tools to the next town when the storm caught me." Haran studied him for a long moment, then nodded stiffly. "Very well. You may stay until the rain stops. Mara, bring him food." He turned away, muttering something about charity and obligation. Lila felt a strange pull as she watched Elias follow the servant inside. He was not like the merchants and noblemen who visited before, men who spoke in boasts and arrogance. This stranger carried himself with quiet dignity, like someone used to hard work and silence. Later, when Mara brought a tray of bread and stew to the guest room, Lila followed, pretending to help. Elias was sitting near the fire, drying his clothes. When he saw her, he stood politely. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," Lila said softly, placing the tray on the table. He smiled faintly, "And yet here you are, braving it too." It was the first time in months that someone had spoken to her with warmth rather than command. For a moment she forgot who she was supposed to be. Not Haran's wife, not the obedient bride, just Lila, a girl who once dreamed of something more. Their conversation was brief but filled with unspoken understanding. Elias told her about his travels, fixing tools, building barns, helping farmers rebuild after storms. His hands were rough, marked by labor, but his manner was gentle. When he asked if she liked living here, Lila hesitated. Her lips trembled before she managed a polite answer. "It's quiet." He didn't press further, but his eyes told her he understood the truth she couldn't say aloud. When the storm finally eased, Haran appeared again. "You'll leave at dawn," he told Elias curtly. "I don't keep strangers longer than necessary." That night, Lila couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the moonlight filter through the rain-soaked garden. She could hear faint movements from the guest room down the hall. Footsteps, the sound of a man repairing his bag, the crackle of a dying fire. For the first time since her wedding, the mansion didn't feel entirely empty. At sunrise, Elias prepared to leave. Lila met him by the gate, holding a small bundle Mara had packed, bread and water for the road. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat neither spoke. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You've shown more kindness than most do." "It's nothing," she murmured. "Just safe travels." He hesitated, then said softly, "You remind me of someone who once waited for her chance to be free." Before she could reply, he turned and walked down the muddy path, disappearing into the mist. Lila stood there long after he was gone, the wind brushing her face. Something deep inside her, something that had been buried under obedience and silence, stirred awake. She didn't know why, but as she looked toward the horizon where he had vanished, her heart whispered the same words she'd spoken to the bird she once freed. If you can find your way back to freedom, maybe I will too. The days after Elias's visit seemed quieter than ever, yet something had changed within Lila, subtle but alive. The memory of his kind eyes, his calm voice, and the way he spoke without judgment lingered in her thoughts like the echo of a forgotten song. For the first time in months, she felt as though someone had truly seen her. Weeks passed, and though Haran's health continued to waver, he remained as rigid and controlling as ever. He monitored the servants, demanded obedience, and spoke to Lila only to issue orders. Still, she carried out her duties quietly, keeping her emotions tucked deep inside where no one could reach them. But sometimes, when she looked out the window toward the distant road, she found herself wondering where Elias had gone. One morning, as Lila tended the garden, she heard a familiar voice calling from beyond the gate. Her heart leapt. It was Elias. He stood there, holding a wooden crate filled with newly forged tools. Mr. Haran requested replacements for the broken hinges and plows, he explained to the servant. He sent for me. Lila's pulse raced. Haran, who often forgot such errands, had indeed mentioned something about needing repairs weeks ago. Perhaps fate had chosen its own timing. She watched as Elias entered the courtyard, his sleeves rolled up, his hands steady and skilled as he examined the ironwork. Throughout the day, Lila found reasons to pass by the workshop, bringing water, offering towels, pretending to inspect the progress. Each time Elias greeted her with the same calm respect, never overstepping boundaries. Yet their conversations grew warmer, layered with quiet trust. You work harder than most men I know, she said once, handing him a cup of cool water. He smiled faintly. Hard work is easier than waiting for miracles. Then, looking at her, he added, but sometimes, miracles come disguised as hard days. Those words stayed with her long after he left that afternoon. Over the following weeks, Elias returned several times to finish his work. Each visit brought light back into the cold mansion. He told her about the villages he traveled through, of orchards blooming again after drought, of children laughing as they helped their parents rebuild. His stories filled the empty spaces in her heart with color and hope, but not all eyes in the mansion were blind. Mara, the old housekeeper, noticed the growing connection between them. One evening as she set the dinner table, she whispered to Lila, "Be careful, child. Kindness can be mistaken for rebellion in this house." Lila nodded, understanding the warning. Still, she couldn't help the flicker of warmth that grew each time Elias's voice reached her ears. The inevitable happened one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon. Haran, returning early from his trip to town, found Elias in the garden, speaking softly with Lila as they repaired a broken fence. The moment Haran saw her smile, a small, genuine smile that had not belonged to him, his expression darkened. "What is the meaning of this?" he thundered. Lila stepped back, startled. Elias straightened, his tone calm but firm. "I was only fixing the fence, sir. Your wife was helping." Haran's face twisted with jealousy and rage. "You dare speak to her?" "To my wife?" His voice echoed across the courtyard. Lila's hands trembled as she tried to explain, but Haran silenced her with a glare. "Leave my land," he spat at Elias, "and don't come back." Elias looked at Lila one last time, a silent message passing between them, not of love spoken aloud, but of something deeper. Don't let him break you. When he turned to go, Lila felt a piece of her heart go with him. That night, Haran's fury boiled over. "You forget your place," he hissed, slamming his cane against the floor. "You belong to me, Lila. You will not shame my house." He didn't strike her, but the words hit harder than any blow. Lila fled to her room, her tears falling like the rain that had once brought Elias to her door. As she sat by the window, looking into the dark garden, she whispered the words he'd left her with. "Fate isn't finished with you yet." For the first time, she believed it might be true. Somewhere beyond the cold walls of that mansion, destiny was stirring. waiting for the right moment to set her free. The mansion grew quieter after Elias's departure. Too quiet. The echo of Haran's rage still haunted the halls, and though days passed, the air inside the estate felt heavy with something unspoken, something dark. Lila moved carefully, her voice softer than ever, her eyes always downcast. Yet behind that silence, a quiet rebellion grew in her heart. Haran had changed since that night. His once commanding posture began to slump, his face turned pale, and his temper flared without warning. He spent hours locked inside his study, poring over papers and ledgers, muttering under his breath about betrayal and lost profits. Servants whispered that his business was failing. His partners had turned against him, and the fortune that once made him powerful was slipping through his fingers. To Lila, he looked less like a monster now and more like a man being slowly consumed by his own bitterness. One evening, as she brought his supper, she found him slumped over his desk, coughing violently. Startled, she rushed forward and caught his trembling hand. For a moment, his eyes flickered open, and the anger she always saw in them was replaced by exhaustion. "Leave me," he rasped, pushing the plate away. "You need to eat," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long time, as if seeing her for the first time, not the frightened girl he bought, but the woman who had endured him. "Why do you care?" he whispered bitterly. "I gave you nothing but a cage." Lila's voice trembled, but her words were honest. "Because I refused to become what cruelty made you." He said nothing, only turned away, his shoulders shaking with a strange, silent grief. The following days blurred into sleepless nights. Haran's illness worsened. Fever consumed him, and his once powerful voice turned weak and ragged. The doctor came twice, shaking his head with each visit. There was little to be done. During those long nights, Lila stayed by his bedside, not out of love, but out of compassion. She read to him softly when he couldn't sleep, sponged his forehead when the fever burned high. Sometimes he spoke deliriously, calling out names she didn't know. Other times he mumbled about a woman he once loved, Asha, a girl from his youth who had chosen another man. "I built all this," he said one night, his voice cracked and hollow, "to prove I didn't need her. But I was only punishing the world for leaving me behind." Lila listened, her heart strangely heavy. For years she had hated him for what he took from her freedom, her youth, her peace. Yet now she saw the broken man behind the cruelty. A man who had tried to buy happiness and found only loneliness. When the end came, it was quiet. One gray morning, she entered his room to find him still, his eyes closed, his hand resting over his chest. The house seemed to exhale all at once, the tension, the anger, the fear. Mara crossed herself in silence, tears glistening in her old eyes. Among Haran's papers, they found a sealed letter addressed to Lila. Inside, in his unsteady handwriting, he had written, "I cannot undo what I've done, but what was once yours I return. The land, the house, the accounts, they all belong to you now. Perhaps freedom is the only apology I can give." Lila sat by the window, the letter trembling in her hands. She didn't cry. Instead, she looked out over the vast fields, golden with the first light of dawn. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel like a prison. The silence was no longer suffocating, and it was peaceful. She buried Haran beneath the willow tree in the garden. With no grand ceremony, no mourners, only herself and Mara, she laid a single white lily on the grave. "May your soul find the kindness you never gave," she whispered. As the wind stirred the branches overhead, she felt something deep within her lift, the weight of fear, of pity, of being owned. For the first time since she was 17, Lila was free. The weeks following Haran's death felt unreal, as though the walls of the mansion were holding their breath, waiting for someone to decide what would happen next. For the first time, Lila walked through every hallway and room without fear of reprimand. The house no longer belonged to him. It was hers. Freedom, however, was both strange and heavy. Lila had imagined it countless times, the day she would finally breathe without chains. Yet when it came, she didn't know what to do with it. The silence was no longer a punishment, but an invitation. What she did next would define whether this freedom became a blessing or just another kind of loneliness. The first thing she did was open the front gates. They had been closed for years, locked to the world. The villagers watched from afar as she stepped out, not as the timid girl they once pitied, but as a woman with quiet determination in her eyes. Lila returned to the small hut where her mother and siblings once lived. The house was nearly falling apart, the roof sagging, the yard overrun with weeds. She learned that her mother had passed away months ago, her heart too weak to fight the years of hardship. Her siblings had been taken in by relatives in a neighboring town. The news broke her heart, yet it also strengthened her resolve. She would not let other girls suffer the same fate. Back at the estate, Lila began to transform the mansion into something new. The grand rooms that once echoed with silence now filled with laughter and purpose. She invited widows, abandoned wives, and poor girls from the village to stay and work with her. Together they cooked, sowed, and cultivated the gardens that had long been neglected. One afternoon, as Lila watched them planting vegetables in the sunlit courtyard, Mara said softly, "You've brought life back to this place." Lila smiled faintly. "It wasn't mine to begin with. I'm only giving it back to the earth." The once cold mansion became a haven. Women who had been shamed, forgotten, or broken by the world now found shelter under its roof. Lila taught them to read and to manage accounts, skills no one had ever bothered to teach her. The wealth Haran left behind was used not for gold or finery, but for tools, seeds, and books. As the months passed, the estate blossomed with color, vines climbing the walls, flowers blooming in corners that had long been gray. The garden that once felt like a symbol of confinement now thrived as a symbol of rebirth. And then one morning, while overseeing a delivery of supplies, Lila froze. Standing by the wagon inspecting the crates was Elias. He looked different, older, sun-touched, stronger, but his eyes were exactly the same. Recognition flashed between them like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Lila," he said softly, disbelief coloring his voice. She smiled, her heart trembling. "It's been a long time, Elias." He took in the scene, the laughter of the women, the growing fields, the transformed mansion. "You've changed everything," he said quietly, admiration shining in his eyes. "Fate changed it," she replied. "I just decided not to stand in its way." Elias stayed for tea and they spoke for hours, about the past, about the storms, both literal and invisible, that had shaped their lives. He told her he had started a small workshop in a nearby town, teaching young apprentices. When he heard of a widow buying tools and giving work to women, he had to see for himself who she was. Before leaving, he handed her a box of farming tools, newly crafted, strong, and beautifully made. "For the land you're bringing back to life," he said. Lila's fingers brushed his as she took the box, a spark of something familiar passing between them. Not the flutter of forbidden affection, but the calm warmth of two souls who had walked through fire and found light on the other side. As he mounted his horse, he looked back once more. "I'll return soon. You'll need help harvesting." Lila smiled. "Perhaps I will." When he rode away, the fields glowed golden beneath the sun. Lila stood there for a long time, the wind tugging gently at her hair. She realized that freedom wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about building something beautiful from its ashes. The seasons turned, and with them, so did the rhythm of Lila's life. The mansion that once symbolized captivity now pulsed with laughter, work, and the soft hum of hope. The women called it the Haven, and travelers passing through the valley often stopped to marvel at the sight. A house alive with music, children's voices, and the scent of fresh bread. Lila spent her mornings walking through the fields, inspecting the rows of vegetables, her skirts brushing against the dew-soaked earth. Each sprouting seed felt like a victory, proof that she had survived, and that life had chosen to bloom again in places where it once refused to. Elias began to visit more often. At first it was under the guise of helping with tools or teaching the women carpentry, but soon his visits lingered beyond the hours of daylight. He stayed to share evening meals, to laugh with the others, and sometimes just to sit beside Lila under the old willow tree that stretched over the pond. There was a peace between them, the kind that grows not from infatuation but from understanding. They had both known hunger, loss, and the cruelty of circumstance. They didn't need grand words or promises. Silence between them was its own language. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Elias found Lila sitting by the fence, her hands dusted with soil, her hair loose and glinting gold in the fading light. "You've done more than anyone thought possible." he said quietly. You turned this place into something alive. Lila smiled softly. Life was always here, Elias. It just needed someone to see it. He hesitated, then knelt beside her. You once told me you didn't believe in fate, that you thought life was only a series of cruel choices. I remember, she said, eyes lowered. And now? He asked. She looked toward the fields, the same fields where she had once walked as a frightened bride, praying for escape. Now, she whispered, I think fate doesn't change people's lives. People do, but maybe fate gives them the chance. Elias reached for her hand. Then maybe fate gave me mine, the day I met you. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind weaving through the tall grass. Then Lila squeezed his hand gently and in her quiet way, gave him her answer. From that evening on, Elias became part of the haven. He built new cottages for the women who chose to stay permanently and designed wooden carts for transporting their produce to nearby markets. Together, he and Lila organized lessons, opened a small schoolhouse, and planted an orchard along the hillside. News of their work spread beyond the valley. Families sent their daughters to learn, and widows came seeking not charity but a fresh start. The estate that had once been built through greed and power became a sanctuary, built on compassion and strength. Years later, as the orchard blossomed in pink and white, Lila would walk through it hand in hand with Elias. She still carried the memories of her past, the pain, the fear, the long nights of uncertainty, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of the soil from which her new life had grown. One spring morning, a young girl arrived at the haven. She was thin, trembling, her clothes torn, the same way Lila once had been. Lila wrapped her in a shawl and whispered the words she once needed to hear herself. You're safe now. This is where new stories begin. That evening, as she watched the girl eat with the others, Elias came to stand beside her. Do you ever think about what might have been if none of this happened? He asked. Lila smiled faintly, her eyes soft. Sometimes. But then I look around and I realize fate didn't take everything from me. It gave me the chance to rebuild, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. The sun dipped low, bathing the house in gold. The laughter of children echoed across the courtyard. Elias took her hand, and together, they walked toward the horizon. Two souls once broken, now whole. And for the first time, Lila truly believed that fate had not cursed her after all.